Yeah,
Magic.
this is good. Elin, you have been on some of the previous talks that we have conducted in form of summits or fireside chats, but usually the first point to begin with a community discussion is kind of introducing yourself. So let us know who you are and what attracted you to the magical space of AI. Let's go there.
Right. So when I was about to leave high school and start university, well, I had done well in high school, so I thought maybe I should become a medical doctor. But no, instead of that, I decided to start studying medical physics or biophysics. I did that. Towards the end, I realized that I didn't really want to go into research like most of my peers, and I started working in the consulting business. And then after a while, I came to the conclusion that if I was going to stay in business, I had to add some business subjects, right? So I had a master's degree in physics, and then I decided to add a master's degree in applied mathematics, or rather what is called operational research, which is a discipline that isn't really that well known in the Nordics, but it stems from how, in particular, the English military services worked with mathematics to optimize the supply chains in the battlefield and around the battlefield, of course, during the Second World War. That
Okay.
discipline then later evolved and is called operational research still. And it is fundamentally about applying mathematics and statistics to any kind of value chain, being it a physical value chain or a digital value chain or whatever it is. But it is really about how do you use data
Mm.
to support decision making or somehow optimize outcomes, right? And then you hear,
Yeah.
"Oh, this sounds a bit like AI, doesn't it?" Yes, but it does, right? And this was 20 years ago, approximately.
Okay.
Then when I finished that, I started working in the insurance industry. And again, it's about using data to make decisions, to predict outcomes, to optimize the business operations. And in the insurance industry, it's also about setting the price and maximizing the bet, right? Because insurance is really about, it's a bet. And so when I left the insurance industry a bit more than 10 years ago now,
Hmm.
approximately, I started working in the tech consulting industry.
Okay.
And around 2017, 18, when the previous wave of AI hit the market,
Hmm.
I was working in the consulting industry in a large consulting company now called Tieto Every,
Okay.
rather large consulting corporation, right? And I had a lot of sales rep resources coming to me saying,
Mm.
Elin, I don't understand this AI thing. Can you please come with me to the client to explain how they can use this technology to somehow create value for the businesses?
Mm.
And that's how my role evolved into this strategic advisor,
Okay.
because I was really bridging the gap between the business value for the clients and the problem to be solved by the
Mm.
tech team, and understanding the pros and cons from a sales perspective. And since then, that is really what I have been doing.
Okay.
Over the last few years, I've been independent, and now I am completely independent. I don't have to answer to anybody else at all, other than my
Mm.
clients.
Mm.
But I'm still bridging this gap between
Okay.
business value and the technology, and also
Okay.
connecting dots, because this entire landscape of AI isn't really about understanding a technical tool set or another
Mm.
software suite in the shelf. It's about understanding the role of mathematics in our world. Could be in business, but also in our society. And because we have so many digital traces, we talk about digital twins, but
Mm.
it's really about digital representations of anything. It could be a value chain of some kind. It could be of me as an individual. It could be of an oil rig or a car or whatever.
Mm.
But as long as we have a digital representation, we can apply mathematics and statistics to make sense out of this representation, to create outcomes, to predict outcomes. And then we call it artificial intelligence, and everybody get a bit confused and we think it's magic. Okay, so the long story of how did I come into the domain of AI? Well, I've kind of always been there. We just didn't talk about AI 20, 25 years ago.
Okay. So, digital traces or digital representation or twins, as you called it, you apply mathematics and then you predict outcomes. That's in simple terms what the technology is about. Great. Like
Very
that's,
simple steps.
yeah, that's really good. Good to get to that level of simplification. Question then is that the technology has been around, as you said, more than 20 years ago when you were in a different domain. Then you were in insurance industry. 10 years ago it was still there. Then you came to consulting industry, it was still there. And now, why the spike now in terms of interest, as opposed to like AI has completely gone out of proportion in terms of like it's covering all news media, it's covering the entire awareness bandwidth that we have in the tech space. It's all AI coming from all different directions. Why now and why not before? Because as you say, this has been latent, it has been existing.
It has. And I think there are at least two different explanations converging there. So let's first just go back to the 60s when the domain of AI was established. It was established as an academic discipline. It was a research discipline for those who were particularly interested. And most of the rest of the academia didn't really bother, right? They thought they were just the weird guys in the corner. And then it had a few summers and a few winters and interest and no interest, you know. And then, so around 17, 18, as I said, the previous wave, that was when it became to a much larger extent an engineering exercise.
Okay.
Watson, Big Blue, beating Kasparov at chess. So at this moment, it became an engineering topic where the big tech consulting companies came into the game, and they saw that here's an opportunity for us to build something completely new and to scale it. But still, it was a bit difficult to explain this to customers. Now, as I said, operational research has been a topic since like the 40s and even before that, which is still about mathematics, but the role of machine learning and the role of operational research didn't really converge for most people because most people didn't really understand what was going on here. So hence it wasn't a big topic. And then 2020 and on, it caught much more interest in the market, and investors and startups started seeing, oh, there's something we can actually use this mathematics called machine learning for. But the big paradigm shift wasn't a technical one, really. But to some extent it was, because the launch of ChatGPT was I'm not sure I should call it a surprise to those who were already in the AI domain, but more a wow moment of how good it could actually be. But it was much more about a communication moment, I'd say, because suddenly 100 million users around the world realized, oh, this AI thing is real. And everybody could just use ChatGPT and test it and experience firsthand that this machine can do things I never thought it could do. It is better than me at writing text. So that was really happened in November 2022 when ChatGPT was launched. It was that humanity realized, oh, this technology is actually rather good. And that's when the ball really started rolling. Because when we humans encounter something we don't really understand, we tend to dedicate it to some kind of divine force. And we did it again. In earlier times, we tended to sacrifice goats and children and food and stuff, and weapons and all that, you know. And we assign divine forces to trees and stones and flowers and crosses and whatever else, right? And then with ChatGPT, oh, singularity, and AI is going to come and take over humanity. And this is what we've been struggling with all through 2023, and we're still struggling with now, and we're going to struggle with it for another couple of years, I think, to explain to people that this is not magic. This is statistics applied to languages. It's much easier to understand and to accept that when we talk about images and video. But when it comes to languages, because languages are so connected to who we are as individuals, to our personality, to our cultures. So simply accepting that we can apply statistics to languages, that is a hard, that is really hard for a lot of people, you know, and most people don't really understand that much statistics. It's surprising how many who struggle to actually calculate a normal average, a standard average. So explaining that advanced maths and statistics can be applied to languages, and the result is that we have a machine or a set of machines that can create outputs better than you. That is problematic. And then from there, you know, we have kind of two directions currently. We have the hype and hype of the hype, and then we have fear and extreme versions of fear. And in between, we have the real opportunities, and some of them are, I mean, it is, in fact, in many ways, a paradigm shift in the opportunities as well. But the real opportunities are much more pragmatic. So we need to clear away a bit of the hype to actually get to the pragmatic value. On the other hand, a lot of the fear is based on not understanding. And there are reasons to be worried, many reasons to be worried. Discrimination and bias is one of those reasons. The use of AI in warfare, which we have already seen on the Gaza Strip, is another reason to be really, really worried. But we need to also tidy up in what we should be worried about. We shouldn't be worried about singularity and the machines coming to take over the planet. We should be worried about all the mess we humans actually create by applying these tools without really thinking about the implications.
Very, very interesting point. That's a lot. I have to cover 2 pages, but let me just summarize for the community and for our listeners coming in and listening to it offline. So really interesting that you talked about that operations research and machine learning have been around for quite some time, but they are kind of separated, and then they started merging. AI emerged as a research and academia, like most technologies, like World Wide Web, emails, that all emerge and then they come to commercial domain. And I think your explanation of the wow moment or the aha was also very interesting, because before the language model integration into AI, it was more like a shelf product. It was too complicated. We walked past the shelf, but first time you actually picked it up from the shelf and you could actually talk to it. So imagine, like, that's a huge paradigm shift. And I think that's what ChatGPT enabled, which every startup's dream is people testing and using their product out of curiosity. So I think that started happening with ChatGPT. But I think then you also brought something very interesting, I'm thinking if we, before going into startup, we should take that, because you talked about this hype on one side and the hysteria on the other side. And then you said there's the real opportunity in between. If the extreme negative or the extreme positive or the selfish motives of AI versus the hugely negative perception of AI can. My question is, how do we create opportunity? Will these two forces eventually become outliers, or will they still be around in the center, the hype and hysteria? Like I'm just trying to create a mental picture. There's a hype, there is a hysteria, and there's opportunity in middle. Will it eventually become an outlier?
That's a
On
good
both sides?
question. So I think at least for the next few years, say a handful of years, we are probably going to see that the alignment between humans and this specific set of technologies, well, that we will get an alignment between humans and this technology. in some way, so that we will kind of calm down a bit. So the hype will calm down.
Okay.
I won't. So I see people call it a bubble. Yes and no. I would say the worst of the hype is kind of a bubble, but the technology is already here, so it's not going to disappear. That's why I won't really agree that it is a bubble. It will slow down, and we will become accustomed to having this toolbox with us in society and in business. It will become a part of our lives. It already is to some extent, but it will become to a much larger extent a part of our lives. And I very often use the example of waking up in the morning. What people do, so like this thing called a smartphone, right? What's the first thing you do when your alarm goes off? Well, you open your smartphone. How do you do that? Oh, facial recognition, a bit of machine learning right there. And then we have the entire day going on. You listen to music, you take public transportation, or you park your car. You access your office perhaps, or you open your computer with some facial recognition, and then you use various tools and applications on your computer all through the day. Maybe you check your bank account, and at least in the Nordics, we typically do that through like an app, right? And then you watch some Netflix maybe in the evening. And those are just a few examples of how we encounter bits and pieces of AI throughout the day, but they have just become natural parts of our lives. And this will happen to a much larger extent across society and in business, also with generative AI, that we get used to having it there. And so a fundamental part of that is to understand the limitations of this toolbox. That is crucial, right? Because you can, on almost a daily basis, see headlines in media and on social media that these large language models or image generators have screwed up somehow. And Google has been ridiculed over the last, couple of weeks for their Gemini model. And we can talk about that in specific, right? But what we need to understand is that these large language models and image creators or generators are not truth machines. They are generators based on a probability of what the next word is, the next phrase, or the next set of pixels. Has nothing to do with truth. And we have to get there to this understanding. And when we get there, we can calm down a bit and say, okay, it's screwed up, but that's just the nature of the beast. And this is going to be extremely important in education, in schools, because kids, students will use these tools. And schools trying to prevent that are just going to waste energy, right? It's more a question of how do you train the kids to use these tools, because these tools are going to stick around. So we better train them to use these tools in a smart way, in a responsible way, and help them to understand the difference between generating and finding facts. Those are two different things. In some instances, yes, we can use the same tools for these things, but we really do need mentally to differentiate between those two things.
Very interesting.
I could just go on talking about
No, but I'll just like to pick something over there. You talked about education and all.
Yeah.
So I don't know, one role of the technology is always to raise the standard of living or the human capacity to a newer threshold, let's say. Before calculators, the threshold were that we had to have a copy and a paper, and you need to memorize tables from 1 to 20, for example. 17 times 2 is 34. Maybe I'm correct. But that was the general threshold before because you were trying to memorize things. And now, fast forward around 30 years, that happened in my lifetime. In my early school, I remember I was very good in table of 10. It was so easy. 10 times 1, 10 times 2, you just add zeros. It was the easiest table to memorize. But there is now discussion right about the time when we had the Gemini model discussion. There is a discussion coming in from one of the large tech companies, which said that programming skills will be irrelevant going forward. So you really don't need to be a good programmer. You just need to think. So I don't know where our threshold, like what threshold we will go up as a humanity, and then that gap in threshold, would that create a sense of irrelevance? Because one of the biggest fear of humanities, even in our personal life, in our love relationships, we want to be relevant, regarded, respected, cared for, have value in our life. That's how we are defined as beings in the softer side. Uh, mm. so I don't know. Maybe the hysteria side is more driven by the fear of irrelevance. That will we become species which are no longer relevant anymore? And work then probably is a part of relevance that it creates. The 9 to 5 grind eventually creates a meaningless or meaningful relevance for us, maybe. I don't know where this went.
So this is a really interesting question, and obviously nobody has the answer, right? Because
Hmm.
we've never been in this situation before. So here's my personal perspective,
Yes.
and I might very well be wrong. But currently, this is what I believe will be our future.
Okay.
On one hand, humans are surprisingly resilient.
Hmm.
So humans will adapt. And we live in this tech bubble. So to us, everything is tech. We eat, live, breathe, sleep tech. But if you look outside at your neighbors and as the people at the bus stop, in the schools, they don't really care that much about the tech. It's there, but there are so many other things between humans and in nature
Hmm.
that are important to us. So I believe that one outcome of this, I'd say, current, in a way, instability when it
Hmm.
comes to human-machine alignment, is
Hmm.
that humans um, will focus more on what does it actually mean to be human and to have connection with nature. So I
Okay.
think we will see more people finding a need for spiritual
Okay.
connections, maybe religious connections, depending on what they choose to believe in or connect
Hmm.
with. I hope that more people will connect more with nature because we need that to be able to save the climate
Hmm.
and not just continue consuming and burning. But also, I think we will have more focus on what is truly human. And what does it actually mean to be human? What is truly human?
Hmm.
That's a tricky one. I always end up biting my own tail when I go into that discussion with myself. Okay, but let's move on. We don't need to dig into that rabbit hole right now.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, when it comes to competence, what does humans need to know? So I think what will happen is that we humans need to up our game on competence.
Okay.
We need to actually learn more, faster, and probably also repeatedly through our careers. Micro learnings
Hmm.
and small bits and pieces of lifelong learning will not be sufficient.
Okay.
And I do not believe in not having to memorize or not having to actually learn many things. I believe we have to learn many things by heart. We have to understand and know facts. We cannot look up everything every time. Because if you have to look up facts and how things work every time you wonder about something,
Hmm.
you will
Hmm.
never be able to learn new stuff. You will never be able to connect the dots because you don't know which dots to connect. So it won't work that we can always say, oh, but we can always look that up. No. Well, yeah, some things you can, of course, look up. We all do that. But we still need to learn more, which means that we need to integrate. We need to know. So I think humans need to upgrade our own competence as a consequence of this to be able to match the technology. Because if we just lean back and say that technology can take over or allow it to take over, we are going to be slaves of the technology. I assume that quite a lot of people are going to do that, but the consequence of that is that we will have a divide in our society, which is not about money, it's about skills. I think that's going to,
Excellent.
unfortunately, because unfortunately, a lot of people are not going to take on the challenge of skilling up that much more. Can't be bothered. They will just not do it.
Very interesting points. Like we talked about the, so I think what I really liked in the discussion, this part of the discussion was that there'll be some sort of a human machine alignment, which would mean three things for the human side of it, which is how we redefine our connection with nature and spiritual side of ourselves. So great point over there. Then we talked about we need to be operating at a higher level of competence, and that competence upgrading happens. Imagine if I were trying to do an accounting sheet without a calculator like 30 years ago or 40 years ago, with a calculator, with a computer spreadsheet and AI enabled. So there's a huge productivity or learning gap. So I'm no longer kind of calculating the tabular form of 17 multiplied by 2. The calculator can do it. In a computer, arrays and everything can be constructed, and I can take. So I think we need to find a higher level of playing ground for us as human beings. Excellent point. And then you made an excellent point on continuous learning, micro learnings. Right now, our learning model is that you need 16 years of incubated. So we run startup incubator for children, like a startup incubator from children from year 1 in school to year 16 in university. That's the length of that deep tech incubator in everybody's life. And that probably is no longer relevant going forward, because I don't remember, if I go back to my high school and remember, I spent 3 months learning the quadratic formula. Minus b plus minus b square minus 2ac over 4a under root for what? What? I don't know. But the really interesting points over here. Let's move to the startup side. So finally, let's discuss that. What kind of implications do you think this will have in terms of startup ecosystems when it comes to founders creating new startups, upgrading current startups, and getting funding for them from the VCs? Like, how is this affecting the AI hype hysteria and then the opportunity middle valley? How is that coming and rolling into the startup world?
So when ChatGPT was launched, a lot of startups quite quickly started building products on top of it to build their own product. That wasn't very wise, right? Because time showed, and it wasn't that much time either. A few months later, OpenAI opened up their own market, and now everybody can build products on top of it, right? So I think startups really need to focus on the problem to be solved, and then think of the entire AI toolbox as just that. It is a toolbox, right? Okay. And then utilize that toolbox to solve the problem, but not for the sake of using the toolbox, but for the sake of solving the problem.
Okay.
And to give an example of that, I come across several startups that in their pitches claim that, oh, we're using generative AI to look more relevant or interesting to potential investors, but they're not actually even using very much automized logic at all. They're just doing it to, well, paint the pig. But that is missing the target. There are so many problems to be solved. And the fact that we can now use mathematics on data to interpret, predict, and generate is just is an amazingly powerful toolbox. So let's use it for that as a toolbox. Keep your eyes on the problem to be solved.
Okay.
And then just realize that in this AI space, there's so much going to happen. There are so many players, small and big. And so also the architecture on top of these large language models is going to develop a lot.
Okay.
So I would say creating products with generative AI or on generative AI for the purpose of generative AI as such, I wouldn't recommend as a path, unless you're planning to become the next OpenAI or similar. But keep your eyes on the problem to be solved.
Okay. So what we are saying is that don't get into the hype of technology for the sake of technology.
Yeah.
Startups still need to have problem as their true north. That's where they're heading.
Yeah.
And if the problem solution requires use of the technology of AI, machine learning, mathematics, if we go back, like we were talking about AI in mathematics, like wherever you think that is relevant, of course, do consider it because it's a new toolbox. So for example, if 10 years ago you were creating a startup and you didn't think about mobile first, maybe that was not right. So maybe it's time that you rethink when you're solutionizing your problem. Can this be solved through some part in AI and then mobile? So you kind of think that the technology toolbox is wider now, includes generative AI and other means AI can be integrated. Great part. In terms of, do you think because it's also about investor side, most of the startup hype is actually a borrowed hype. So startups usually are trying to figure out, so wake up in the morning, as you said, after seeing your phone and recognizing yourself on the phone, you kind of get an article, okay, this startup got funded in this big way due to this. So I think founders' mindsets are pretty much kind of aligned with what is happening in general tech market and scene, and that's where I think the recent investments in the AI landscape may be shifting it. Do you think this is something like would venture capital, because venture capital has itself gone through a major transformation in the last couple of years, like in pre-COVID, COVID, and then after COVID time. Right now, venture capital, I think, is in a mess. I don't know how we'll get out of it. But AI is still there in the center stage. Is this something temporary or would AI remain a funding focus for the market? I don't know. It's a big question.
Yeah, so we're probably going to annoy a few VCs and investors here. So I've stopped counting how many times I've heard investors saying, oh, but this is machine learning. That's not real AI. And I'm thinking to myself, what do you think AI is? Magic?
Okay.
So I think also on the investor side, we tend to think of them as superhumans with all knowledge.
Okay.
They're not. So what I think investors really need to do is to skill up properly on what is AI, where can it actually be beneficial, and where should you rather think of maybe simpler ways of getting to the target of the business or the problem to be solved. And the use of AI alone isn't a reason to invest. And a promise of using AI also isn't a reason to invest.
Okay.
I'll give you an example, which to me is just a brilliant example of what I would call a bit of human stupidity. So I came across, it was a startup pitch a couple of years ago. I won't say who it was or where it was, but I can say what it was. It was a team that had created a hydroponic herb pot that you could have in your kitchen to grow salads and herbs. Which isn't really radical, right? But what they had done was, first of all, get a nice design, which also isn't very radical. And then they had put a chip in the pot so that you could monitor the health of the plant, because it was hydroponic, right? So it could the sense water. And then you could control it by an app.
Okay.
And so they got a question about, so who's your primary customer group here? And the answer was somewhere along the lines men 40 to 50. And the argument that was used towards the investors was that is hydroponic, is using sensor technology and AI, and is this sustainability operationalized? I'm like, this is a stupidity operationalized. First of all, that good old flower pot that you could throw in the regular garbage, perhaps, or in glass and ceramics, has now become electronic waste because you put a data chip in it. And why the heck do you need a sensor with a data chip in a regular flower pot in your kitchen to monitor the health of a plant? You could just as well just have a look at it. Is it green, or does it look like it's about to die? And this was supposed to cost a couple of €100 or along those lines per pot, right? And we need to really think a little bit about which problems are we solving with this set of tools, because that kind of solutions solving problems that don't really exist. And then we are just, again, painting the pig with a bit of tech. And it really isn't good for our planet. So we need to think about where are we applying this technology for which purposes.
Very good points. And I think the message that I've written here for our community is that when we talk about startups, I think the North Star still needs to be the focus on problem. And then solution could involve whatever tech you need to involve to solve that problem. And for the investors, I think an excellent point over there that there is a skilling up required on the investor side, because they have a huge burden of assessing the technology for what it will be in future from a startup. Because startup is here coming for today, but when you exit the startup in 5, 7, 8, 10 years, it'll be something very different. And what would be the technology at that point in time? Which brings us, like, for example, I've traditionally seen VCs very good in financial due diligence. Up to before AI period, technical due diligence was a weak part of VCs. So there was a lot of technical firms coming in and kind of complementing, can we help you with technical due diligence of the code. I think a third layer now needs to be created, like AI due diligence, like some sort of processes need to be there, like is this technology required? To what level is it a technology that remains in a regulations sphere and still operates responsibly and still achieves the benefits that it can? So great points over there. Let's move to one more point before we close off the conversation, which is because somewhere you mentioned this plant and then resources, and it was coming to me. I was checking a startup presentation late last night, and they were talking about the water AI is going to consume going forward, the geopolitical implications. So I don't know, how do you think? Let's talk about a little bit on regulation, the geopolitical side, and the general societal, how would you say, mainstreaming of the technology. What will it do?
You said the last few minutes. We could go on for a couple of hours on the topic. Okay, so let's just jump into this by acknowledging that 5 prompts on ChatGPT requires about half a liter of water for cooling of the service. And we don't know, the market doesn't know how many requests are currently being sent to these large language models every day. But assumptions are in the range of a few 100 million prompts every day. Let's say then, for simplicity, 100 million.
Okay.
And okay. So then you can easily calculate that would require 10 million liters of water for cooling every day on a planet where a lot of countries are now struggling with having enough water for drinking water and for agriculture, so producing food, right? And this is a huge challenge. And it's not just the processing of the data processing in the data center, but it's also the production of the chips themselves. Okay. But these things are happening at different on different sites around the world, right? So even if I'm here in Norway sending those 5 prompts to ChatGPT, for example, and using that half a liter of water somewhere, that half a liter of water is not used here. It is perhaps in a desert in the US or in Spain or somewhere else. It could also be here in Norway. Or in Ireland. It's raining a lot, so they don't really care that much about the water, perhaps. But really, if we then add, so who produced the data chips used for the processing? Probably NVIDIA, if we look at their market positioning right now.
Mm.
And that means that it also very, very likely that the chips were produced by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, because 80%, 85% of the chips from NVIDIA are produced by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company in Taiwan. They don't have that much water, so they're also struggling with access to clean water for agriculture and for drinking, right? So the geopolitical challenge here is that what I do here in Norway will have significant implications somewhere else in the world. It's just, I am just one. And when we have millions of people everywhere and they contribute to this skewed use of resources around the world, that is going to create instability. And I'll just give you, we talked about water, but of course, power consumption is another one. Because, so again, if we revert back to ChatGPT and its peers, and I say its peers because it's not just OpenAI and Microsoft, right? There are many others too, not just in the US. Some of them are Chinese as well, and from the Middle East and around other parts of the world. But again, if you revert back to, say, 100 million prompts every day, which is probably on the low side, that means that every day these generative AI, and I'm limiting it now to generative AI, require somewhere between the equal amount of 20 to 30,000 households consumption of energy every day. The data centers are currently, if we include crypto and generative AI, about 2% of the world's energy consumption. Estimates from the International Energy Agency is that within the next 4 years, it will double. We are then on 4%, which is really a lot. And so good old-fashioned prediction models, they don't consume anywhere near that amount of power nor water, right? Because they are much simpler, much easier, much lighter. It's a completely different story. It is about the generative AI models, the large language models, because they are so enormous, and the enormous amounts of data and the enormous amounts of processing. So it is about generative AI.
Got it.
And that's really problematic. And then let's add a bit to that geopolitical challenge, right? Because if we think back to the data chips, we need electricity, we need water, but we also need precious metals. Where do they come from? Mining.
Yeah.
And a lot of the mining happens in the Democratic Republic of Congo, China, Russia, Indonesia. The Norwegian government has recently opened up for deep sea mining. In the North Sea. It has been criticized heavily internationally. It's a potential scandal. But why? Because the world needs precious metals. So fundamentally, if you believe generative AI is a good thing, you cannot be against mining by definition. Slightly problematic, isn't it?
Yeah. But this is really, I completely agree. This conversation could go on for hours, but I think we touched on so many different areas for AI. So I think it brings a lot of value to the community when they even review this talk afterwards. Elin, thank you so much for being here with all the passion. And really happy that we could discuss all these aspects for startups, because startup building is one part. Generally, startups need to survive in the world, and they are creating products for people, so they need to be aware of what the impact of technology will be, plus minus, hype, hysteria, middle opportunities. I think that's a very interesting model that you kind of explained today. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me and also allowing me to speak freely about some of my perspectives.
Awesome.